The iron door at the end of the corridor was sealed with 7 locks, each one forged from black steel and carved with warning glyphs that burned faintly in the dark. Every member of the vampire court had told her the same thing in the same breath, with the same cold certainty that people reserve for facts they consider irrefutable. Do not go in. He is gone. There is nothing left to save. The Duke of Belisar has been lost beyond the reach of blood, reason, or mercy, and if you open that door, whatever is inside will kill you before you finish drawing your next breath. Juliette Voss pressed her palm flat against the cold iron anyway. She could feel the vibration of something alive behind it, something enormous and furious and in tremendous pain like a storm trapped inside a bottle. Her hand did not shake. She had stopped shaking 3 days ago, somewhere between learning that Alaric Belisar had been deliberately poisoned with a compound designed to dissolve the boundaries between a vampire's rational mind and his most ancient predatory instincts, and learning that the person who had ordered it done was seated on a throne 1 floor above her, smiling at his own court with borrowed power, Vale Morvain. The name tasted like rot. He had arranged everything with elegant precision. First, he had engineered Juliette's exposure to the court, ensuring she arrived under circumstances that looked accidental. Then he had fed Alaric a corrupted blood compound laced with something the court physicians called the dissolution, an ancient, forbidden weapon that did not kill vampires outright, but instead severed the cognitive architecture that separated a noble vampire's will from his hunger. Left long enough in that state, a vampire duke would lose everything that made him himself. He would become a weapon, and a weapon without a master was eventually put down by court law. That was the plan. Vale would inherit the Belisar territories, the Belisar blood seat, and the ancient compact that gave the Duke of Belisar authority over half the vampire governance of Western Europe. There was only one problem with the plan. Juliette had figured it out. She had not come to this underground court hidden beneath the old financial district of Vienna because she was brave in an abstract sense. She had come because 6 months ago, a white-haired, silver-eyed vampire with the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding entire centuries had stepped between her and a group of lesser court predators who had decided a human woman wandering too close to their feeding grounds was fair game. He had not done it because she was helpless. She had already broken one of their wrists and was working on a second. He had done it because the look on his face when he saw her fighting back had been something she had never seen on a vampire's face before. It had been respect. His name was Alaric Belisar, and she had hated him for approximately 40 feet before realizing somewhere around the 5th that she was in serious trouble of an entirely different kind. Now she placed her second hand on the iron door and began working the locks. She had the keys because she had taken them from the body of the court physician, who had been bribed to administer the dissolution and then silenced with a secondary poison to prevent him from ever recanting. She had found the evidence trail by doing what she had always done, by being the kind of person who noticed small things, who remembered offhand comments, who treated the testimony of low-ranking court servants as seriously as the declarations of ancient nobles, because sometimes the person who refills the wine goblets sees everything. The 7th lock released with a sound like a held breath finally let go. The door swung inward. The darkness inside was absolute and it moved, which meant it was not darkness at all. It was him. Juliette stepped through the doorway and said, quietly and clearly, his name. Alaric, the movement in the dark went still. She could not see him, but she could feel the temperature of the room change, the way air changes when something predatory orients toward you. Her pulse was steady. She had controlled it deliberately for the last hour, knowing that a racing heartbeat in a room with a vampire in dissolution state was equivalent to ringing a dinner bell. She breathed in. She breathed out. Her heartbeat remained even. Alaric Belisar. She said his full name this time, the way she had heard the older court members use names, with weight behind them, with the implication that the name itself carried an obligation. I know you are in there. I know you can hear me. I need you to listen to me. Because I have information, and approximately 40 minutes before Vale Morvain realizes what I have done, and I refuse to deliver it to your corpse. A sound came from the far left corner of the room. Not a word, not yet. But it was something articulate underneath the raw animal resonance of it. It was something that was trying. Juliette walked toward it, every instinct in her body that had been honed by 2 years of living in the margins of the vampire world, of learning its rules and its dangers by proximity and by necessity, and sometimes by surviving things that should have killed her. Every one of those instincts told her to walk faster, not slower. Confidence was not arrogance here. Confidence was the only currency that had value. She stopped 3 feet from where the sound had come from and sat down, cross-legged on the cold stone floor. I am going to tell you what I know, she said, in the same tone she used when she was explaining something complicated to someone who was under pressure. And then I am going to tell you how we are going to fix it. And then you are going to help me, because you are Alaric Belisar, Duke of the Western Compact, and you have never, in the 400 years of your existence, let anyone take what is yours without a reckoning. The darkness shifted. Something was very close to her now. She could feel the cold of it, the particular chill that radiated from a vampire of significant age, amplified by the dissolution compound that had pushed his predatory nature to the surface like oil on water. And then she heard it, low and fractured, and clearly costing him everything he had. One word, Juliette. She exhaled slowly, and for the first time in 3 days, something in her chest loosened. Yes, she said. I am here. She told him everything. She told him about Vale Morvain and the manufactured alliance documents that had been placed in the court archive under Alaric's own seal, a seal that Vale had access to because Alaric had trusted him as a second, because Vale had been performing loyalty for 11 years with the patience of someone who understood that the most dangerous betrayal is the one built slowly enough that it looks like devotion. She told him about the dissolution compound and its sourcing, a supplier in Prague who dealt in forbidden alchemical contraband and who had been paid through 3 layers of intermediary accounts that Juliette had unraveled by following the one thread Vale had been careless with, a servant. A young court runner named Petra who had been used as an unwitting courier, and who, when Juliette had found her crying behind the kitchen corridor 3 nights ago, had told her everything she remembered about the errand, because Juliette had sat with her and listened, and not once made her feel like a fool for not knowing what she had carried. She told him about the blood law Vale intended to invoke, the clause of abandoned dominion, which stated that a vampire lord who could not govern his own predatory nature forfeited his territory and title to the nearest eligible claimant within the court compact. It was an ancient law, designed for a different era, and it had not been invoked in over 2 centuries, but it remained on the books, and Vale had been studying it for years. She told him about the antidote. This was the part that made the darkness go very, very quiet. There was an antidote to the dissolution compound. The Prague supplier had included it in his documentation as a matter of professional completeness, because even black market alchemists maintained a kind of clinical thoroughness about their work. The antidote required a specific blood compound, introduced directly into the affected vampire's system, not from a donor, but from a willing participant who understood what they were offering and why. The blood had to carry an emotional imprint, which was the archaic component that most modern practitioners dismissed as superstition, but which the oldest court physicians maintained was entirely functional. The dissolution attacked the cognitive architecture of a vampire's identity. The antidote rebuilt it, and what it needed as a foundation was not just blood chemistry. It was recognition. It was the blood of someone who knew who the vampire was and chose to be there. The darkness was very quiet for a long time. Then Alaric Belisar said, in a voice that was shattered at the edges, but recognizably, unmistakably his, "You cannot. The risk to you." "I know the risk," Juliette said. "I did the math." Juliette. Her name in his mouth at that moment was the most complicated word she had ever heard. It contained, in its 3 syllables, a warning and a terror and something else that she had been forgotten for semanas, because examining it felt like looking directly at the sun. "If I lose control during the process, you will not. You cannot know that." "I know you," she said, and she put everything she had into it. Every conversation they had ever had, every moment he had placed himself between her and danger without being asked. Every time he had argued with her across a table, and then, when she won the argument, looked at her with that particular expression she had catalogued and set, sighed and refused to name until right now. "I know who you are. That is the entire point." A silence. Then, "You are the most infuriating woman I have ever encountered in 4 centuries of existence. I am also the one with the antidote compound and the keys," she said. "So we should probably get started." She had brought what she needed in a medical bag borrowed from the court infirmary, which she had accessed by presenting herself with calm authority as an assistant to the senior court physician, who was currently occupied with an emergency she had manufactured by leaving an anonymous note about a possible contamination in the eastern wine cellar. The antidote compound was a clear liquid in a sealed vial. It required introduction to the bloodstream through a fresh wound, and the documentation had been very specific about the sequence. The human's blood first, willingly given, immediately followed by the compound, and the vampire had to receive both in the window of 2 minutes. She opened the bag and set out what she needed with methodical efficiency. "Come into the light," she said, because she had propped the door open and the corridor outside was faintly lit by the court's permanent underground lighting. "I need to see what I am doing." He came. The first thing she noticed was how much effort it was costing him. Alaric Belisar, in his ordinary state, was the single, most controlled being she had ever encountered, moving through spaces with the unhurried precision of someone who had learned that stillness was power. What came into the faint light was something raw and barely contained, like a blade that had been heated past its tempering point. His white hair was disordered, and his silver eyes were burning with something that was not quite sanity and not quite its absence, but was instead the terrible borderland between them, and his jaw was locked tight with the effort of being here, being recognizable, being himself. He looked at her like she was the only fixed point in a dissolving world. She held his gaze and did not flinch. "Sit," He sat. She worked quickly and precisely, explaining each step as she did it, because she had learned that giving someone under extreme stress a clear verbal map of what was happening next reduced their physiological distress response, and she suspected this applied to vampires in dissolution state, as much as it applied to humans in trauma. She took a small blade from the bag and made a clean, shallow cut across her left palm. She had chosen her left hand deliberately, keeping her right free for instrument work. She was not going to pretend it did not hurt, because it did. But the pain was clean and manageable, and she had factored it in. The moment the cut opened, she felt the quality of the air in the room change. She felt Alaric's entire body go rigid with the effort of holding himself still. Alaric. Her voice was steady and clear. Eyes on my face. Not my hand, my face. He dragged his gaze upward. The silver of his eyes was fracturing at the edges, the predatory hunger of the dissolution compound, fighting with everything that was actually him, and she could see, viscerally, what it was costing him to sit there and not close the distance. He was shaking. She had never seen him shake before. It undid her in a way she was not going to deal with right now. "You know me," she said. "Say it, Juliette Voss," he said through locked teeth, 26 years old, former forensic accountant, currently the only human in the Western Compact, who argues with court edicts by citing their original Latin phrasing and winning. "You take your coffee without sugar. You sleep with the window open, even in winter. You told me once that you do not believe in impossible things, only in things that have not been explained yet. And I told you that was the most arrogant thing I had ever heard, and you said good, because it is also true." Something in his eyes steadied. "You know me," she said. "I know you," he said. She placed her cut palm against his and introduced the compound. What happened next was something she had been warned about and had prepared for, and was still, when it came, more intense than any preparation had quite covered. The compound worked fast. She felt the pull of it through the connection at their joined hands. Not pain exactly, but a profound pressure, like something very large moving through a very small space. Alaric made a sound that she would never be able to adequately describe, and his hand closed around hers with a grip that would have crushed the bones of a less prepared person, and she breathed through it because she had trained herself to breathe through things, and she talked to him, kept talking, kept the thread of her voice consistent and present and real. She talked about the first time they had met. She talked about the argument they had 3 weeks into knowing each other, when he had attempted to restrict her access to the lower court archives because, he said, the information contained therein was not appropriate for a human with no standing, and she had informed him with considerable precision that she had already read most of it because the archivist had left the reading room unlocked on Tuesdays, and she had an excellent memory. She talked about the night he had found her in the Eastern Tower library at 3 a.m. working through the blood compact records, because she had a theory and could not sleep, and instead of throwing her out, he had sat across from her and read in silence for 2 hours, and then, without comment, pointed out a cross-reference she had missed. She talked about the way he looked when he was thinking, the slight tension at the corner of one eye, the absolute stillness of someone whose mind was moving very fast. The grip on her hand was becoming less crushing. The sound he had been making had stopped. The light in the room seemed to shift. Alaric Belisar raised his head, and his eyes were silver again, purely, clearly silver, and present in his. He looked at her hand in his. "You are bleeding," he said. His voice was his own, completely his own. "Yes," she said. "That was the plan." He stopped himself, looked at her face. She watched the moment he took in what she actually looked like. Not the controlled exterior she had been projecting for the last several hours, but the exhaustion underneath it. The 3 days of no sleep, the fear she had been metabolizing quietly and alone, because there had been no one in this court she trusted enough to be afraid in front of. His expression changed in a way she had no precedent for interpreting because she had never seen it before. Very carefully, he released her hand. He reached into the pocket of what had been, before several days of deterioration, an extremely well-tailored coat, and withdrew a folded cloth that was clean, because, of course, it was, because he was Alaric Belisar, and he would maintain the habit of having a clean folded cloth in his pocket while descending into dissolution the way other people maintained the habit of breathing. He wrapped her palm with precise, unhurried care. "Thank you," he said quietly, when he had finished. She had been expecting a lot of responses. She had not been expecting simple gratitude, and it went through her defenses like a key through a lock she had not known was there. "Do not thank me yet," she said. "We still have Vale Morvain to deal with, and we have," she checked the time on her phone, 23 minutes before his people do a cell check. Alaric stood. The transformation was remarkable. Whatever the dissolution had done to him over the last several days, the antidote had done its work with extraordinary completeness. And what stood in the faint corridor light was everything she recognized. The contained power, the absolute stillness, the regal bearing that was not performance, but simply the natural posture of something very old and very certain of its own authority. He was not entirely recovered. She could see the cost of the last few days in the set of his shoulders, in the slight pallor that was additional even for him. But he was present, he was himself. He was in every way that mattered. Back, he looked at her with an expression she still did not have a word for. "Tell me," he said, "exactly what evidence you have compiled and where it is secured." She told him. As they moved through the corridor, she outlined the full picture, the documentation she had photographed and stored in encrypted files across 3 separate cloud servers with access keys known only to herself, the testimony she had recorded from Petra. The court runner, using a directional microphone she had borrowed from a journalist she knew, who covered underground court activity for one of the more discreet supernatural news networks, the financial trail she had documented across 7 shell accounts, the original supply invoice from the Prague alchemist, and the testimony she had obtained from a senior court archivist by the simple method of presenting the evidence she had already gathered and allowing the archivist's conscience to do the rest. Alaric listened without interrupting. This was something she had always appreciated about him, that when he listened, he actually listened, not as a courtesy, but as a function, absorbing information with the precise attention of someone who understood that the quality of the response depends on the quality of the intake. When she finished, he said, "You did all of this in 3 days. 2.5, she said. The first 12 hours were mostly figuring out that Vale was the source. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. They were in a secondary corridor that fed into the court's eastern access routes, which she had already mapped. "Juliette," he said, "why did you not leave?" When you discovered the scope of what Vale had arranged, you had sufficient information to remove yourself from the court entirely. You had grounds to bring the evidence to external vampire governance bodies. You did not need to come into that room. She looked at him. He looked at her. The corridor was silent except for the distant sub-bass hum of the court's ventilation system. "You know why," she said. He held her gaze for a long moment, and she watched him take in the thing she was saying underneath the words she was saying, and she watched him wield it careful rather than examine it immediately, which was exactly what she needed him to do, because they had 19 minutes and a coup to dismantle. "Yes," he said. "I believe I do." They moved. Vale Morvain had arranged the court gathering for this evening under the pretext of an administrative assembly, which would give him the audience he needed when he invoked the clause of abandoned dominion and presented himself as the emergency claimant to the Belisar seat. He had prepared documentation, witnesses, and a theatrical case that was, Juliette had to concede, extremely well constructed. He had been building it for 11 years. She and Alaric reached the court's main chamber through the servants' access route, which she had scouted 2 days ago. They came through the eastern anteroom while Vale was in the middle of his prepared address to the assembled court nobles, approximately 40 vampires of varying age and standing, seated in the tiered gallery of a chamber that was simultaneously an architectural marvel and deeply unsettling, all black marble and cold amber lighting and the kind of silence that ancient beings produced when they were collectively attending to something. Vale Morvain was standing at the presentation floor with the easy confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment so many times it felt like memory. He was tall and dark-haired and expensively assembled, and he had the particular quality of elegance that came from very carefully controlled performance. He was saying something about the tragic deterioration of a once great duke, about the painful duty of the court to act in the interest of its territorial continuity, about the ancient blood laws that were not punishments but protections. Alaric walked through the main doors. The effect on the room was immediate and total. 40 vampires who had been attending to Vagel's presentation turned in unison toward the entrance, and the quality of the silence changed from the silence of an audience to the silence of a room holding its breath. Vale Morvain went very still. Alaric crossed the floor with the measured, unhurried stride of someone who was profoundly, fundamentally unbothered, and everything in the quality of his presence said what no words needed to say. Here is someone who has been sovereign of this room for centuries, who has temporarily been inconvenienced, and who has returned to settle accounts. He stopped at the center of the presentation floor and looked at Vale Morvain with an expression of such perfectly calibrated contempt that several of the younger court members actually leaned back in their seats. "You appear," Alaric said, "to be standing at my podium." Vale recovered with impressive speed. He had prepared for contingencies. Juliette had anticipated this. She was already moving through the room to the court's senior recorder, a meticulous elderly vampire named Edvard Kraus, who maintained the court record and who had the standing to formally introduce evidence into proceedings. She reached his station at the side gallery while Vale was making his case that the Duke's presence here did not invalidate a dissolution finding, that the court's medical record indicated the condition had been confirmed. "Senior Recorder Kraus," Juliette said quietly, placing a sealed document packet on his desk. "I am formally submitting evidence under the court's petition of contested proceedings provision. Article 17 of the Western Compact Administrative Code, which allows any party with material evidence bearing on an active proceeding to present said evidence prior to final determination." Edvard Kraus looked at her over his spectacles. He was approximately 800 years old and had the air of someone who had seen everything at least twice and was not particularly startled by any of it. He looked at the document packet. He opened it. He read the cover summary with the expression of someone doing a very careful accounting. He reached for his formal recording pen. Across the floor, Vale was speaking more quickly now, pressing toward a formal invocation of the clause, trying to get the words on record before the situation shifted further. He was a skilled political operator, and he understood that timing was everything, that if he could get a formal ruling motion entered before the evidence was admitted, "I invoke the right of material stay," Edvard Kraus said, in the measured tones of someone who had been making formal court pronouncements for 8 centuries and found no occasion required raising his voice. The room went very quiet. Evidence has been submitted under Article 17. The current proceeding is stayed pending review. Formal evidence presentation will commence now. Vale turned to look at Juliette. The look on his face was the look of someone who had built an 11-year architecture of betrayal and is watching one human woman take a Rex ball to the support columns. Juliette met his gaze and did not perform anything. She simply looked at him and let him see that she had done what she had done and that she had done it thoroughly. Then she stood before the court of the Western Compact and presented her case. She had done public speaking before, under worse conditions, and she knew the single most important thing about presenting complex information to a powerful audience was to lead with the clearest fact and build from there. She led with the financial trail. Numbers were not interpretable. Numbers were not open to spin. She walked through the shell account structure, the payment timeline, the correlation with the dissolution compound acquisition and the Prague alchemist's invoice, and she did it with the clean, precise efficiency of someone who had spent years building cases from documents. She presented Petra's recorded testimony, acknowledged the court's obligation to assess the credibility of the source, and then presented the corroborating documentation that removed the credibility question from the equation. She presented the bribed physician's own documentation, the records he had maintained, with the clinical thoroughness of someone's who believed he would never be caught, which contained, in his own handwriting, the dates and compound concentrations of every administration. She presented the archived correspondence that Vale had sent through encrypted court channels over the preceding 2 years, which the archivist Juliette had recruited, had been able to access, using the master archive keys that were a function of his position, and which contained enough of Vale's strategic planning to make his intent unmistakable. The court was absolutely silent. When she finished, she looked once at Alaric. He was standing at the center of the floor with his hands clasped behind him, watching her with an expression that was, by any reading she could make of it, something close to pride, not the condescending pride of someone watching a lesser entity perform unexpectedly well. The pride of someone watching someone they consider an equal do what they do at the highest possible level. She looked back at the court. Edvard Kraus said into the silence, "Does the party under submission, Vale Morvain, wish to respond?" Vale looked around the room. He was still trying to find the angle, still looking for the move. She could see it. He was very good, and he was calculating very fast. Alaric said, "Vale." It was a single word, spoken in the way that a name becomes a door closing. Vale looked at him. "I have known you for 11 years, Alaric said. I gave you access to my seal. My archive, my court, and my trust. I want you to understand that I am aware of every piece of evidence that was just presented, and that I have had the opportunity to assess it fully, and that there is no version of a response that will alter the court's determination of what you have done." He paused. "So the question that remains is simply whether you intend to have the dignity of a surrender, or whether you prefer to make this more complicated." The room was extraordinary in its silence. Vale Morvain, who had spent 11 years performing loyalty with the patience of a saint and the ambition of a conqueror, looked at the human woman who had dismantled him in 72 hours, and looked at the Duke he had spent a decade trying to remove, and made the only rational calculation available to him. He surrendered. The court took 2 hours to formalize the findings, which was actually quite efficient by vampire court standards, where proceedings that involve the potential stripping of standing from a long-established court member could technically extend across multiple sessions. Edvard Kraus was efficient and thorough, and the evidence was so comprehensively assembled that there was very little room for procedural complexity. Vale Morvain was stripped of his court standing, his territorial access, and his compact membership. Under the blood laws governing betrayal of noble trust, he was given 8 hours to remove himself from Western Compact territory before the Compact's enforcement authority was directed toward his apprehension. It was, all things considered, more lenient than he deserved, and Juliette suspected that the leniency was partly a function of Alaric's instruction, because Alaric Belisar was someone who understood that the most powerful statement of authority was not the harshest possible response, but the most precisely calibrated one. When the formal proceedings concluded and the court began to disperse, Juliette sat down for the first time in several hours. She sat in one of the chairs along the side gallery and placed her hands in her lap and looked at the middle distance and allowed herself, very briefly, to be completely exhausted. She heard him approach. She did not need to look up to know it was him. She had catalogued the particular quality of his movement over 6 months of proximity, the way he occupied space differently from everyone else in any room. He sat beside her. Not across from her, beside her. For a long moment neither of them said anything, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that did not require filling. "Your hand," he said finally. She looked at her left palm. He had wrapped it cleanly, and it had mostly stopped bleeding. The cut was shallow and would heal without issue. "It is fine," she said. "I am aware it is fine," he said. "I am also aware that you made a deliberate choice to give your own blood in a room with a vampire in dissolution state, which is not something most people with functioning self-preservation instincts would consider. I had calculated the risk." "You calculated the risk," he repeated. "And having calculated it, you went in anyway. Yes, because you knew I would not hurt you." She turned her head to look at him. He was watching her with those clear silver eyes, and the expression she had been refusing to name was right there again, close enough to touch, and she was tired enough and far enough past the crisis point that she decided it was probably time to stop. "Refusing, because I knew you were still in there," she said. "I knew it was not gone. Whatever the dissolution did, whatever Vile thought he was engineering, he underestimated what it actually takes to erase someone like you. You are 400 years of... You are too much of a specific person to be dissolved by a compound in a few days." She paused. "And yes, because I knew you would not hurt me." "That was a considerable act of faith," he said. "Given the circumstances, I prefer to think of it as a considerable act of accurate assessment. The corner of his mouth moved. It was the smallest possible version of a smile, but on Alaric Belisar's face, which typically expressed things with the careful economy of someone who had learned to guard what they showed, it was enormous. "Juliette," he said, "there is something I have not said to you, which I am going to say now. I want you to understand that what I am about to say is not a function of gratitude for what you did tonight. Gratitude implies a transaction, and this is not that." Her heart had picked up, she noticed. Quietly, just slightly. "Then what is it?" she said. "It is," he said, with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing words with extreme precision, "the acknowledgement of something I have been refusing to examine at close range for approximately 5.5 months, which is that I have never, in 4 centuries of existence, wanted anyone's presence the way I want yours, not because you are convenient or useful or remarkable, though you are all 3, because you are you, specifically, irreplaceably." The gallery was empty now. The chamber lights had been reduced to their minimum. They were sitting in near darkness, and the silence had a quality to it that felt like a room waiting for something. "I have thought about the practical arguments against this," he continued. "I have thought about them extensively. You are human. I am not. The timeline of human life against an immortal existence is not a small thing, and I do not want to say that it is. There are also the court complexities, the question of your standing in a world where you do not have formal compact membership, the risk that attaching yourself to a vampire duke's life exposes you to exactly the kind of dangers you encountered in the last 3 days, and likely others." "I am aware of all of those things," she said. "I know you are," he said, "which is why I am not going to pretend they do not exist. I am going to say instead that I find myself unable to frame a future of any length that I actually want to inhabit if you are not in it, and that this is new information that I am still processing, and that I am aware I am processing it out loud in front of you, which is not my typical mode of operation." Juliette looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then she said, "Alaric, I walked into a locked room containing a vampire in dissolution state, who, by every piece of credible testimony available to me, was a danger to any living being in proximity to him. I walked in without a weapon and sat down on the floor and called your name because I believed you were still enough yourself to hear me." He met her eyes. "I think," she said, "that tells you where I stand on the practical arguments." The silence that followed was the kind that has a shape to it. He reached over and took her uninjured hand, not the bandaged one, the other one, and held it with the kind of care that did not perform itself, that simply was. His hand was cool, the particular coolness of him that she had become accustomed to enough that it felt like comfort rather than strangeness. "There is one more thing," he said. "The practical question of your lifespan against mine. I am not willing to simply set that aside. It is real and it matters to me. I want you to know that there are options I would be willing to explore with your full understanding and consent. Not as a condition of this, but as something I would want you to know exists. The Western Compact's oldest blood documentation contains records of the transition rite." "I know about the transition rite," she said. He paused. "Of course you do. You have read everything in the archive, not everything, but a significant portion." She turned her hand in his to hold it properly, fingers interlaced. "I have thought about it. I will continue to think about it. It is not a decision I would make quickly, and I would not want you to ask me to." "I would not," he said. "I want you in exactly the form you are currently in, for as long as you wish to be in it. Everything else is a conversation we have together over time without pressure. "Good," she said, "because I have approximately 900 more questions about the blood compact records, and I will need several years to ask them all at minimum." The smile this time was not small. It crossed his face like something that had been waiting a long time for permission to arrive, and it completely undid the careful, controlled architecture of his expression and showed her something she had never seen before, on a face that she knew well and had been observing closely for 6 months. Joy. Actual, unguarded joy. 900 questions, he said. "I expect I can accommodate that." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He did not stiffen or redirect or maintain the careful physical distance that had always existed between them as a kind of mutual acknowledgement that proximity was loaded. He simply adjusted slightly so that the angle was more comfortable for her and rested his cheek briefly against the top of her head with a gentleness that was so precise it felt like a promise. They sat in the empty, darkened chamber for a while and did not talk about anything, and it was enough. The days that followed were not simple. They never were, after a court crisis of that magnitude, and Juliette had enough understanding of how vampire political structures worked to know that the ripple effects of what Vale Morvain had attempted would take time to trace and address. There would be an audit of the court records going back 11 years. There would be a review of every alliance document Vile had had any access to. There would be political repositioning among the Compact's member houses as each of them recalibrated their own standing in light of the new information about what had been happening in the court's hierarchy. Alaric threw himself into it with the focused, methodical thoroughness that was simply how he operated. Juliette watched him work and understood that this was as much a part of his recovery as anything, the return to agency, to governance, to the active exercise of the authority that had been nearly stripped from him. She had her own role to play. She had not expected to be formally recognized by the Compact, but Edvard Kraus, with the air of someone completing a bureaucratic necessity that should have been attended to earlier, submitted a formal recommendation to the Compact's governing council that Juliette Voss be granted the status of allied human under Noble Compact, a specific legal category that had existed since the 14th century and was rarely used, but which provided a human individual who had demonstrated material service to the Compact with formal standing, legal protections, and the right to move within Compact territories without requiring noble escort. Alaric had not requested this. He had not asked for it or arranged it. He told her so directly when she asked, because she asked directly, as she always did, and he told her the truth, as he always did. Kraus submitted it on his own authority, Alaric said. He told me afterward that he considered it the obvious and correct administrative response to what had occurred, and that the only reason such recognition had not been submitted before was that no one had thought to do it. His words, "I like Kraus," Juliette said. "He likes you as well. He told me you were the first human he had met in 3 centuries who cited Article 17 correctly on first reference without looking it up." "I looked it up the night before," she said honestly. "I just memorized it before I got there." "That is not a material distinction," Alaric said. "The preparation is part of the competence." She received her Compact recognition in a brief, formal ceremony that was attended by the court and conducted by Edvard Kraus with the efficient dignity he brought to everything. She wore the same clothes she had been wearing for 3 days, because she had not had time to get anything else, and she had managed to find a bathroom long enough to make herself presentable, and she stood in front of 40 vampires who had watched her dismantle a decade-long conspiracy in 72 hours with clearly imperfect personal preparation, and received her formal standing with her chin up and her spine straight. Alaric stood beside her. He did not stand behind her or ahead of her. He stood beside her at the same level, which in court protocol was a statement of equivalence that every vampire in the room understood, and which would be talked about in political circles for decades. She suspected, after the ceremony, Petra the court runner found her in the eastern corridor and grabbed both of her hands and said, in a rush of relieved gratitude, that she had been so frightened she would be blamed for what she had unknowingly carried, and that Juliette had saved her from that, and she did not know how to. "You saved yourself," Juliette told her. "You told me the truth when you had reason to be afraid of doing that. That was you." Petra was crying a little. She was also, Juliette noticed, extremely young by vampire standards, possibly only a few decades old, which in vampire age brackets put her at approximately the emotional equivalent of a 20-year-old human, and she had been used by someone very old and very cynical, and had come out of it with her honesty intact. "Also," Juliette said, "if you are interested, I am going to need someone who knows the internal layout of this court very well to assist with the archive audit that is going to be happening over the next several months." "Would you want to do that?" Petra blinked at her. "Me? You have a good memory and you are trustworthy," Juliette said. "Those are the qualifications I need." Petra said yes. The archive audit was, as it turned out, a months-long undertaking, and it was among the most intellectually engaging projects Juliette had ever worked on. She and Petra and Edvard Kraus and 2 court archivists spent the better part of 4 months systematically reviewing 11 years of records, reconstructing the actual history underneath Vale's manufactured version, identifying every document that had been altered or fabricated, and building a corrected archive that the compact could rely on going forward. Alaric checked in on the audit regularly. He did not micromanage it. He had a court to run, and he ran it, and part of the reason he was excellent at it was that he knew when to delegate and when to provide direct attention. But he appeared in the archive room with predictable frequency, sometimes bringing documents he thought might be relevant, sometimes simply sitting at the far end of the large reading table and working on compact correspondence while she worked on the audit, and the quality of silence between them in those sessions was something she had begun to depend on in a way that felt very fundamental. They talked. They talked an enormous amount about the archive, about court history, about the blood laws and their philosophical underpinnings, about the ethics of vampire governance in a modern world that was still mostly unaware of the compact's existence, about the practical challenges of maintaining historical institutions in contemporary contexts, about her past and his past, and the ways in which both of them had ended up where they were. He had 4 centuries of stories. She found that she could listen to him talk about history for hours, because he had been present for it in a way that made it immediate rather than academic, and he found that she asked exactly the right questions to get at the things he actually found interesting rather than the things he was typically expected to perform interest in. He told her about the early years of the Western Compact, which he had helped found in the 17th century, after a period of catastrophic territorial conflict between vampire houses that had made the current political landscape look tranquil. He told her about what it had been like before that, when there were no consolidated blood laws, only individual houses and their private codes, and the violence that resulted. He told her about the early decades of his own existence, when he had been young enough and volatile enough to be genuinely dangerous in ways he did not enjoy remembering, and what it had cost him to build the discipline that was now as natural to him as breathing. She told him about why she had left her previous life, not dramatically, but honestly. She had been working in financial forensics, finding fraud in the structures of companies, following money through paper trails, and she had been good at it, but the work had existed in a world that did not have enough texture. She had started noticing things that did not fit the ordinary world's explanatory framework, discrepancies that pointed toward structures and economies that operated outside conventional visibility. She had followed those threads with the same methodology she applied to everything else, and the threads had led her, eventually, to the margins of the vampire world and then into it, and she had found that the world she had wandered into had more texture than any she had previously inhabited, and she had not been inclined to leave it. "You wandered into the vampire world," Alaric said, in a tone that was entirely neutral, "by following financial discrepancies. The shell account structures are genuinely distinctive," she said. "Once you know what you are looking for." He looked at her with that expression she now had a name for and had stopped being frightened of. "And you never considered that it might be dangerous?" "I considered it. I decided it was worth the risk." "I tend to do that." "Yes," he said. "I have noticed." There was an evening in the 6th month after the crisis, when they were in the High Library of the Belisar court residence, which was a room she had come to think of as the most beautiful room she had ever been in, with its 3-story walls of shelved books and its tall windows looking out over the Vienna night and its fireplace large enough to stand in. She was reading and he was across the room, doing something with correspondence, and she had been aware for the past half hour of the quality of the silence changing, becoming charged, the way it did, sometimes when they were in the same space and something was shifting without either of them quite having addressed it yet. She set down her book. He set down his pen. She was not certain who crossed the distance first, or whether they both moved simultaneously, which was possible, because they had developed an unsettling level of synchronization in their understanding of each other's intentions. She knew that she was standing very close to him, and that the high library window was dark behind them, and the fire was the primary light source, and that he was looking at her with everything carefully open. No armor, no managed presentation, just him. "I want to be very clear about something," she said. "Please," he said, "I am not here because you are a duke. I am not here because you are ancient or powerful, or because the compact gave me a formal status that is convenient. I am here because of who you specifically are, in all the ways you specifically are it. The particular way you think, the way you listen, the way you are honest even when it is inconvenient, the way you sat across from me in a library at 3 a.m. and read in silence, and then pointed at a cross-reference without making it into something." His expression was entirely open in the way it had been in the court chamber when she had finished presenting the evidence, and again in the archive when she had told him something true, but more so, deeper, more irreversible. "I want you to know the same thing in return," he said, "that nothing about the practical landscape changes what this is for me. The political implications, the court's assessment, what it means for a Duke of the Western Compact, to be attached to a human woman who is also functionally the most dangerous person in any room she occupies. None of that changes anything. What I feel for you is not in negotiation with any of it. Good, she said, because I already ran the numbers and the risk-to-reward ratio is entirely favorable. He laughed. It was a real laugh, full and unguarded, and she decided on the spot that making Alaric Belisar laugh genuinely was something she was going to dedicate considerable effort to for the foreseeable future. Then he framed her face in his hands with the same precise care he applied to everything, cool and steady and absolutely deliberate, and kissed her with the gravity of someone who had waited 4 centuries to meet someone worth taking seriously and found her. She kissed him back with the wholeness of someone who had spent her entire life being capable and competent and self-sufficient, and had found to her own considerable surprise that being entirely seen by one specific person was not a weakness. It was the thing she had not known she was looking for. In the following weeks, the court adjusted. Courts always adjusted, because they were ancient institutions with a long history of accommodating new configurations of power, and what Juliette and Alaric represented was unusual but not unprecedented. There had been human-vampire partnerships at the noble level before, and the blood laws contained provisions for them, even if those provisions had not been exercised often in recent centuries. What was perhaps unprecedented was the particular quality of what they had, which was not the subordinate protection of a human kept by a vampire court, but the explicit partnership of 2 people who had been tested under genuine crisis conditions and had come out of it knowing exactly what the other person was made of. Juliette formalized her role in the court audit and made it permanent. She became, officially, the Western Compact's first human archival investigator with compact standing, which was a title that Edvard Kraus created specifically for her, because the closest existing category was 3 centuries out of date and did not apply accurately. She negotiated the terms of her position herself, with Alaric present but not speaking on her behalf, because she had insisted on that with great clarity, and he had understood immediately and respected it completely. Petra became her primary assistant and turned out to be not merely good at the work but remarkable at it, with an eye for documentary inconsistency that Juliette recognized as a genuine gift. The question of the transition right came back around, as Juliette had always known it would, not as pressure. Alaric was absolutely consistent in his refusal to apply any, but as a conversation they were ready to have. One evening in the High Library, with the fire going and the Vienna autumn pressing against the tall windows, she had been thinking about it for months. She had read everything she could find about it in the compact records and had asked Alaric direct questions about what the experience had involved for the vampires he knew who had undergone it or witnessed it, and had taken the answers seriously without romanticizing them. The transition was not nothing. It was a profound and permanent change, and she held it as such. "I want to be honest about what motivates me," she said. "I do not want to make this decision out of fear of losing time. I do not want to decide because I am afraid of what eventually looks like. If I decide to do this, I want it to be because I am choosing a specific life, not fleeing a specific ending. That is the only reason I would want you to do it," he said. "I mean that entirely. I know you do." She looked at the fire. "I have also been thinking about what I would be doing with that time. What kind of work is possible over the span of an extended life? How different the accumulation of knowledge and skill looks when you have centuries rather than decades. I find that I think about it with interest rather than fear. The interest is encouraging, he said. It is also, she said, that I cannot construct a version of a very long future that I want to inhabit without you in it. She looked at him. Which is, I believe, the same thing you said to me several months ago. It is, he said. So. Not immediately, she said. I want more time in this specific form first. I want to finish the archive project. I want to do a number of things that feel like they should be done as I, now, however long you want, he said. However long. But yes, she said eventually, yes. The silence that followed was one of the most complete silences she had ever experienced, and it was full of everything. She crossed the distance between their chairs and sat beside him on his, which was large enough for this, and he wrapped an arm around her, and she settled against him, felt the coolness of him, and the stillness and the specific, unmistakable quality of being held by someone who intended to keep holding on for a very long time. I have approximately 600 remaining archive questions, she said. Down from 900, he noted. I have been efficient. You are always efficient. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. Ask me all 600. She stayed in Vienna. She stayed in the court. She stayed in the high library with its 3-story walls of books and its fireplace and its view of the city at night. She stayed in the life she had found by following financial discrepancies into a world that no one else she knew could see, which had turned out to contain exactly the kind of texture and complexity and specific person that she had not known she was looking for. The Western Compact continued to operate, as it had for centuries, with all the politics and history and occasional crisis that implied. The archive audit was completed, certified by Edvard Kraus, and formally entered into the Compact's permanent record. Petra was promoted, with Juliette's strong recommendation, to a permanent archivist position that carried formal court standing. Vale Morvain, having been expelled from Western Compact territory, disappeared into the broader vampire world's political margins, which were vast enough that an expelled noble could find a new position given enough time and sufficient reinvention. Juliette kept a file on his known movements, not obsessively but methodically, because she had learned that the most dangerous kind of threat was the kind you stopped watching. Alaric was aware she did this and considered it entirely sensible. The evening of the winter solstice, 6 months after the high library conversation, Alaric took her to the upper tower of the Vienna court residence, a space that was not typically opened to court functions, private and extraordinary, with a glass ceiling designed centuries ago by someone who had understood that immortal beings might occasionally need to see the sky without going out into it. She looked up through the glass at the stars and felt him stand behind her, close enough that his coolness became her warmth, and his arms came around her from behind, and he held her with the contained, absolute security of someone who had decided and would not be undecided. There is something I intend to ask you, he said, and I want to preface it by saying that there is no correct answer, and there is no answer I would not fully respect, and nothing about what we already have is contingent on your answer. She tilted her head back against his shoulder and looked up at the stars. Ask. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she could feel the weight of 400 years considering its words carefully. Will you stay? He said. Not because the court needs your expertise, though it does. Not because you have a position and a title and a role, though you have all three. Will you stay because this is yours, this court, this life, This very long and complicated and rewarding thing I am proposing we build together, and you are choosing it with your full self and your full knowledge of what it involves." Juliette looked at the stars through the glass ceiling. She thought about forensic accounting and following money through paper trails and discrepancies that did not fit the ordinary world's framework. She thought about a white-haired vampire who had looked at her fighting back in a dark alley and met her eyes with something she had never seen on a vampire's face before. She thought about a locked room with 7 black steel locks and the fact that she had opened them all. She thought about everything she knew about the man currently holding her and the extraordinary length and weight of the answer she had to that knowledge. "I already stayed," she said. "The question has been answered since the locked room. I just needed time to say it out loud." His arms tightened around her. "Then it is settled," he said, in the voice he used for things that were final and true. "It is settled," she agreed. Above them, through the glass, the winter stars were ancient and clear, and entirely indifferent to the concerns of anyone below, which was the kind of perspective that Juliette Voss had always found, paradoxically, enormously comforting. The universe was very large and had been running for a very long time without requiring her input, and in that enormous, indifferent context, 2 specific people finding each other and deciding to stay was small and brief and absolutely, completely, everything. She reached up and covered his hands with hers. He held on. They stood under the stars and let the settled thing be settled. And the future, which was long and complicated, and theirs began exactly there.